The Gulf states are unified in calling for a de-escalation of the Middle East war. These are the words from Qatar this Tuesday as Tehran launched new strikes against its neighbours. But is this a disingenuous statement? Reports are pointing to a totally different stance among Gulf states, aware that a total defeat for Iran could well gift them control over the Strait of Hormuz, as well as a longer-term peace. Here at France 24, James Vassiner with this.
A full month of war, and some want more. At first, there appears to be a common stance among Gulf countries.
Our understanding is that there is a very unified position in the Gulf on calling for de-escalation and an end to this war. But I would say that you should ask, every country about their own positions on this.
But a glance behind the scenes paints an entirely different picture. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait and Bahrain are all reportedly urging the United States to continue the war against Iran. Speaking on condition of anonymity, officials from each country say that their authorities want to see bigger changes to Iran's leadership or in its conduct before the conflict comes to an end. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are said to be particularly eager, with the latter even pushing for a ground invasion. This comes despite continued attacks from Iran, which has launched thousands of drones at its neighbours since the beginning of the war. Gulf countries had at first complained about a lack of warning from the United States ahead of its first attacks, but are now hoping to see a deal that will best guarantee their security.
The Navy's gone, the Air Force is gone, we know that.
US President Donald Trump has expressed conflicting opinions, claiming that Iran's leadership is sufficiently weakened, while also threatening to escalate the war if an agreement isn't reached soon.
Let's get more on this one and bring in Dr. H.A. Hellyer, Senior Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Dr. Hellyer, as always, thank you for joining us here at France 24. We appreciate your time. I'm wondering how you're reading the stance of the Gulf states right now in this war.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be on with you. I think that there's a bit of a divergence among the Gulf at present. There will be those who are moving towards escalation because, frankly, they don't trust that the Iranians will not continue to strike them or escalate in the event that this war comes to an end in the future. And I think that they have good reason to be concerned in that regard. So you have some who are moving towards escalation, particularly the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Bahrainis. But also you have others in the Gulf, particularly the Qataris and the Omanis, who are also incredibly angry about how Iran has targeted them, even though they try to stay out of all of this, but seem to be moving more towards de-escalation as opposed to thinking beyond that. I think that broadly, though, there is consensus on a few things, one of which is that none of these states want Iranian state collapse, which distinguishes them from the Israelis, who frankly couldn't care less if the state in Iran collapsed and might even see it as a good thing. I don't think that the Gulf states at all want that. I think they would be very concerned about stability in Iran, and then they, of course, have to bear the consequences of such instability, something that does not seem to trouble Tel Aviv and, frankly, Washington, D.C. So there is that note of consensus. But I think there's another note of consensus, which is bad for Tehran, and that there will be no going back to business as usual. The Iranian regime struck all of these countries, despite the fact that all of them seem to try very hard to stop this war from taking place, and they will not forget that.
The Gulf states till now have been, of course, a bastion of stability, a place where people have gone for business, for pleasure, a place where things, as advertised, can grow and thrive. All that changed, of course, since February the 28th with the drone attacks coming from Iran towards what are perceived as US allies there. I'm wondering, is this going to be, given they will need some kind of different arrangement with Iran, a push for regime change? Will that be what the Gulf states will be pushing for, pushing Donald Trump to do?
No, I don't think so. And again, not because they have any sympathy for the regime in Tehran. On the contrary, I think none of them have sympathy for the regime in Tehran. But I think they know and they are aware that there's no such thing as regime change in Iran that doesn't result in a huge instability for the country. It's not going to be Venezuela, Forget about it. Not happening like that. It would be more like Iraq after the Second Gulf War. It would look incredibly chaotic. I don't think that they're interested in any of that. I think also that there's a wider consideration across the Gulf where they recognize that their main security partner, their main security, I won't say guarantor, but their main security underwriter, let's say the United States, embarked on a war in their region, in the Gulf region, without centering Gulf security, so without respect for the security assessments of the Gulf itself in its own region, and at least partly, and I would say partly, I don't think that responsibility is mainly here, but at least partly because of lobbying and urging and pressuring from Tel Aviv, from the other power in the wider Middle East region that the Gulf considers to be incredibly destabilizing. Of course, they consider the Iranian regime to be destabilizing. They also consider the Israelis to be destabilizing, given the genocidal war that they wrought on Gaza, invasion and occupation of Lebanese and Syrian territory, striking Doha last year. Imagine from the Gulf perspective that they're seeing a war unfold, which has been incredibly destabilizing for them, especially vis-a-vis energy supplies and the Strait of Hormuz being effectively closed and so forth. Being a war that began without centering their security considerations at all, at least partly because of another actor in the region that they deem to be destabilizing. None of this looks good for them.
We've heard Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to the Israeli people tonight in Hebrew. We took as much of his speech as we could capture live. The theme seemed to be listing the achievements that as he sees them and trying to reassure as he sees it the future of Israel as he wants it to be. At the same time, the condemnation from the likes of Mark Owen of Canada saying the occupation of South Lebanon is illegal. 10 European countries as well, including Britain, France and Italy, falling in line with that opinion that what is happening is not something that should happen under international law. Is this going to be, do you think, the pressure that pushes Netanyahu into a different stance, or does he just not care?
So first, if you'll allow me,
Please.
It's not an opinion. It is illegal. Okay? There's no opinion about this. This is fact. And I think it's important to call things by their name. This is an illegal invasion. Of what Israel is doing in the south of Lebanon does not have standing in international law. Hezbollah are odious. Hezbollah are a terrible movement that have taken Lebanon into a conflict that the vast majority of Lebanese did not want to get into. It does not excuse in the slightest the way in which the Israelis have threatened to turn different parts of Lebanon into Gaza. They've said it, into Rafah. Okay, this is absolutely unacceptable. I don't think that Netanyahu cares. I think Netanyahu will push the narrative that opposition to Israel's moves in Lebanon is basically anti-Semitic, that the world is against the Jewish state, and that they need to move in order to secure the future of Israel in a quote-unquote new Middle East. But this new Middle East is one in which Israeli paramountcy, freedom of action to strike beyond borders without reference to international law reigns supreme. And I don't think this is a recipe for a sustainable solution in the wider region. I don't think it's a security architecture that the vast majority of the region is interested in. I think that the peoples of the region want to see stability, peace for all peoples in the region, and you can't have that with any type of paramountcy being put into play like this, and certainly not one that has been taken to the International Court of Justice on genocide charges and the International Criminal Court on war crimes charges.
Dr. Hellyer, thank you very much indeed for your analysis of the situation. Dr. Hellyer joining us from the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you, sir, very much indeed.